The great burning of the Library of Alexandria. Oh, what a shame. Humanity lost so much that day. So much knowledge was lost. We would have been ahead in science, math, and, measuring the Earth by now. Imagine a human colony thriving on Mars, because we would have had been there for 200 years by now if this one library didn't burn down. A tragic tale of civil war for the Romans when Julius Caesar lit the library ablaze. Or so many people think. To be honest, it doesn't really matter. Well, we certainly lost a bunch of knowledge, but it may not be the kind you think. And to be honest, there wasn't just one great burning of the library. There were 3 separate times we would call the burning. So who's responsible for spreading these rumors? Perhaps Edward Gibbon, an 18th century author who wrote about it, or Carl Sagan. That's right, legendary astronomer Carl Sagan aired his show Cosmos in 1980, and in the opening scene, he talks about how all the knowledge in the ancient world was in these marble walls, but it tragically burnt down. Is he right, or is this a rumor and we did not lose much when that library burnt down? What even was the Library of Alexandria? It was definitely not the first majorly huge library, although it is a top candidate for biggest at the time. Others before it included the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh and the Library of Babylon. Ptolemy I established the library in Alexandria in 283 BC, A, because it was the royal capital of Ptolemaic Egypt at the time, and 2, Alexandria was the hub of trade for the Eastern Mediterranean in the 200s BC, making it a prime candidate for the concentration of knowledge. They reportedly copied every text that came on ships to the city through boats, as well as sending royal agents out to collect every text they could, paying exorbitant amounts for the program. The library wasn't actually built until Ptolemy II, likely more of a flex of the might and wealth of Egypt rather than for advancing humanity's knowledge at the time. The Museum of Alexandria, as it was called, had libraries, temples, lecture halls, gardens, shrines, actual museums, a dining hall, and even a zoo. It was pretty much an early college campus. It's much more useful to think of it as an ancient version of Harvard University rather than a building where they stored all their books and scrolls. And like an ancient university, most of the knowledge did not come from storing books but by scholars researching and writing their own works. Alexandria became a city known for academic freedom, just not political freedom. A scholar was killed for making fun of the king's, very related sister wife. The Kingdom of Egypt supported up to 100 scholars working full-time at the library, studying everything from math to geography to religion to poetry, although most of these guys worked in poetry. The major focus of the library was poetry, particularly Greek poetry, and making commentaries on these poems. In fact, there is so many dry commentaries on other works that eventually the term Alexandrian was used to mean boring and unoriginal writing. But still, the cultural and scientific achievements were unprecedented in the ancient world, like the first use of alphabetical sorting, a measurement of the Earth's circumference, and the invention of the Archimedes spiral all came from this great library. Sometime around 210 BC, the Library of Alexandria hit its peak of knowledge with somewhere between 40,000 and 500,000 books, although that range doesn't really help narrow the amount down. And just 70 years after its establishment, the library was already starting to decline. Around 210 BC, Ptolemaic Egypt got into a war with the Seleucids, the kingdom was unstable, politics were unstable, and the library was inherently a political entity funded directly by this royalty. After this, the library became more of a tool for political power rather than a free academic institution. For instance, one head librarian, Aristarchus, supported Ptolemy VII, but after Ptolemy VIII killed number 7 for his own spot on the throne, Aristarchus was forced to flee for fear he would also be killed. Many Greek scholars fled Alexandria over what can only be called Proto-Egyptian nationalism, taking their knowledge back to Greece or elsewhere in the Med. Remember, it wasn't the amount of books the library was known for, but the scholars working there, so when they fled, the library lost its value. Ptolemy VIII went on to even ban all foreign scholars from studying in Alexandria, a move which cemented the decline of the library. All of them fled, usually continuing their works at another library or founding their own schools. An increasingly extractive king and increased instability with economic hardship meant that there wasn't much money left for the library's budget, and so it got cut, shrinking the power of the library even more. The library was now a fully political tool. The kings after Ptolemy VIII would appoint loyalists as the head librarian to push their political agendas, just like the Oracle of Delphi was in Greece. By 100 BC, the scholars which had spread around the Mediterranean standardized and distributed pretty much all classic Greek poems, something which was Alexandria's specialty. And by 80 BC, the city was taken over by Rome, bringing an era of peace and political stability. But the damage was already done. The scholars and status which the library once had was already gone. All of this happened before even the first burning of the library. The tragic tale, according to all of these comments, starts now, even if it was already after the library was a shell of itself. We can split the burning of the library into 3 separate times. The first burning of the library happened during a 4-year civil war in Rome between Caesar and Pompey. Eventually, fighting came to Alexandria and Caesar was cut off from the city from a huge Pompeian fleet. So to get rid of these wooden, very flammable boats, Caesar ordered them to be burnt. Surprise, it turns out fire can spread, and it might have accidentally burnt down a large chunk of the city in 48 BC. Part of this was the library, or at least the storage house where they kept the books. It's tough, but it's unknown how much was lost in that fire, although Mark Antony gave his girlfriend Cleopatra about 200,000 scrolls to repay the damage after the fighting. The second burning was a little more controversial. About 400 years later, in 391 AD, Theophilus, the leader of Alexandria, transformed a temple inside the library into a Christian church. The Jews of Egypt got pretty mad at this, and so did the Christians when they were attacked by the Jews in the streets. Eventually the pagans got involved too, and it was a whole religious mess. Christians started attacking Jewish and pagan scholars at the library, and it escalated into the burning of the Temple of Serapis, located on the library's campus. It's estimated that the temple held around 10% of the books in the entire library, which is still a huge loss of knowledge, but not nearly the damage told by many. And perhaps the greatest damage done to the books in the library happened 200 years after that in 640 AD. It wasn't necessarily the burning of the library, rather than the direct burning of books in the library. During this time, the Muslim Caliphate was expanding fast, very, very fast. They reached Alexandria and started sieging it in 640 AD by Caliph Omar and Amr ibn al-As. Part of their sieging was to burn those books against the newly made Quran and keep those that were with it. It reportedly took about 6 months to burn all of those unholy books, but this whole story wasn't written until about 300 years later by a dubious source, so take it with a grain of sumac. So, the Library of Alexandria was never burned down fully in a great fire that handicapped the ancient world to be behind centuries in science, math, and literature. Only sections of the library burnt down, and when the majority of the books did burn, maybe, it was already about 800 years after the decline of the library. By this burning, the library had lost almost all of its status it had as a great hub of knowledge, or at least cultural hub, as most works in there were commentaries on poetry or commentaries on other commentaries. You can think of the library like a react channel on YouTube, but instead of watching videos, it was more about reacting to ancient poetry. And let's be honest, all of those world-changing scientific discoveries, well, ended up changing the world, and those that didn't still ended up being worked on as scholars fled the library out of political persecution. So let's look at all of these comments and people talking about how we're so behind because of this great burning and tell them the truth. I'm sorry, Carl Sagan. The Library of Alexandria did not die from massive explosions and a great fire. The Library of Alexandria died a slow, painful death from fleeing scholars, political fear, and budget cuts, not even 100 years after it was founded.